It seems that Americans have lost trust in the media. Is that deserved? Here to explain is Bill D'Agostino. He's an expert at the Media Research Center. Bill, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So you guys just released a report on this. I think, I want to get into your report about, coverage of a particular topic and have you explain that. But just broadly, I think this is something we've been seeing play out over decades, not recently. But first, tell us what you found in this new report you released.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a man named Kiltmar Abrego Garcia, who the news media have been talking a lot about. I assume most of your viewers will have heard about this. He's the man mistakenly deported to El Salvador. And what we found was that cable networks, at least, have been leaving out a lot of inconvenient details for a narrative that they want to push about this man. We found that, for example, only 3% of CNN's reports on it had any mention of the fact that the man actually entered the country illegally. And only about 40% of their stories actually discuss the fact that he's not originally from here, meaning that over 60% implied that he was from here, or at least a naturalized citizen. On MSNBC, pretty similar case. 15% of their stories mentioned that he entered the country illegally, and just about 30%, only 30% mentioned that he was not from here. So that's that's kind of troubling as far as if you take all that data together, you have a much better than 50-50 chance if you get all your news from, say, CNN or MSNBC of believing that basically this was a naturalized American citizen who the Trump administration rounded up mistakenly and then sent to another country.
Right. So this was the man who was deported, and they said it was without due process. Mm-hmm. And then the White House shot back. It's like, well, this is actually immigration hearings are not processed through the judicial system. There are immigration judges, but immigration judges aren't part of the judiciary. Actually, they're part of the executive branch, and they handle all these cases that come in. And so there was a lot of emphasis on the due process issue. Did you see any other, examples of ways, right or left, where this story wasn't really reported accurately?
Yeah. One issue that kept coming up again and again on specifically MSNBC, although we didn't see CNN fall into this pitfall much, which was good, was we found 11 instances on MSNBC where they went beyond just deliberately misrepresenting the very limited protection that this man had. And what he had, just to clarify, is something called a withholding of removal to El Salvador. And that's not the same as temporary protected status. What that means is you're still deemed removable by an immigration court. But for whatever reason, in this case, it was because he claimed he feared for his life. A judge has granted him temporary relief in the form of, okay, if we deport you, we will not deport you to that specific country. Mm-hmm. On MSNBC, we found 11 instances where they went beyond just phrasing that a little creatively. I would say they actually deliberately misrepresented what he had. People were calling him a legal resident. The host Ari Melber of The Beat on two separate occasions said point blank, they arrested the wrong person, which that's not true at all. They absolutely knew who this person was. So yeah, that was I'd say the most troubling detail that we found in the coverage.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, you're really an expert, I think, in seeing how, in particular, how cable news misreport stories, and it's not limited to that. But I think that over the last few decades, we have seen the esteem for cable news just precipitously fall. It's been one thing in the mainstream media in general. And it's not that alternative media is so much better always or so much more credible than mainstream, but mainstream media has just made so many public mistakes. Everything from, the starting of the war in Iraq, which, was pretty much driven by poor media coverage and bad intelligence and all this stuff. You're leading up into, COVID, for instance. I mean, there's other things between the war in Iraq and COVID, but COVID, I think, was terrible for the media because of the way they pushed certain narratives about the vaccine. There was no balance. There was no tempered approach to, well, let's talk about this, have an expert on both sides. It was a propaganda machine pushing one side and condemning people who weren't aligned. And then, of course, networks like CNN became so so adamant in their anti-Trump coverage that not only do they not really succeed in keeping Trump from getting elected, which seemed to be their goal, they lost most of their credibility. And, there's plenty to criticize Trump for, but they didn't do it in a way that maintained their credibility. So I'm curious what you think about that analysis. Has trust in the mainstream media really just fallen off a cliff? And what does it look like in this modern age, in the internet news age, for networks to be fair, but still criticize, the president or whoever it is without losing credibility?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really important question. I think that without question, mainstream media trust is at its lowest point, and it has been, interestingly, every time it's polled, it's at its lowest point in the last 5 years. So it is not just down, but it's precipitously declining, and it's going down more and more. I'd call that a massive self-inflicted wound. I believe that largely the corporate media, at least, are very lacking in actual journalists. I think that most of the people who go into corporate journalism these days are primarily political actors and activists who happen to have chosen journalism as the vehicle for their activism, as opposed to having any kind of love for the profession qua the profession. As far as what that looks like in the future, if they're going to adapt, if they want to kind of rehabilitate their image and regain some trust, I don't think what that looks like is, for example, some kind of come to Jesus moment for all of the hosts on CNN and MSNBC all saying, oh, geez, you know what? We have been pushing a narrative. That's our bad. We'll try to do better. That's not really realistic, right? I think that what happens if they do adapt is you're going to need to see a pretty hefty cleaning of house. And I think that the most political and radical actors who are the most dug in on their narrative have to part ways with these networks. In other words, a pretty massive personnel change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's probably something to that. I mean, just anecdotally here in the DC area, I know people who work at these networks, who work at different outlets, and the stories they tell, are just about, for instance, only fact checking certain candidates in the election. Right. Or fact checking people on the small things, but omitting their big lies to give this appearance of fact checking them, but not actually fact checking them on their biggest policy claims, just the little details they get wrong. That's one I personally knew about from someone who worked at one of these big networks, how certain candidates they wouldn't fact check and others they would aggressively fact check. There's just things like this. And I think at this point, people are so onto it that they don't trust. I mean, the ratings aren't the ratings for all these networks. Your average YouTube video, maybe not average, but a good YouTube video gets more than a nice viewership on CNN. Am I right about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Most of these primetime news shows these days are lucky to break 1 million viewers. And that's a far cry from the state that they were in even like 5 years ago. I will say that the broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, are also losing viewership at a pretty, if I worked for them at least, I'd call it a pretty alarming rate. But they still have a pretty healthy audience. They still get anywhere from, depending on the network and the evening, anywhere from like 4 to 7 million viewers per network per night. And so actually a lot of the work that we do at the Media Research Center is primarily focused on the broadcast networks. A lot of people think of them as kind of this dinosaur of the industry. But if you look at total reach and viewership, they bat well above their or swing well above their weight as far as like comparisons to CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News are concerned.
Right. And people don't know this, but they're basically subsidized by the government. Right. They may not get direct payments, but they get these very expensive licenses for free. Right. I mean, so they're getting basically subsidized by the federal government.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not a conversation that's been had in quite some time. I believe that Trump's FCC director is the first person to have brought this up in decades. The notion that, OK, maybe we should be holding their feet to the fire a little bit and expecting some accountability if they're going to be given this basically incredibly generous gift by the government.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's something, maybe you'll work on a piece about government funded media, because a lot more than people realize these networks, ABC, NPR, PBS. They're all under scrutiny now in the Doge era. And we didn't have time to go into their bias. Maybe we could have you back, Bill, to talk about some of the bias at NPR and PBS. But
that's a whole other can of worms. Yeah.
Oh, that is a good one. Yeah, we got to have you back to talk about that. We're out of time for this segment, but I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for your insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, man.